I know from all the research I do and also from reading a lot of the viewer comments that the average American is in trouble right now, especially when it comes to debt. And I wish I had this information a couple days ago when I read the story about JP Morgan saying everyone's paying cash for cars now, so everything must be great. But I saw a lot of comments in there talking about how people have had their used car for sale for quite some time and it's still not selling. And it's not even that expensive. And this is probably why. And it's because U.S. household debt just reached $152,000. Now, to be fair, mortgages do account for 2/3 of that debt. But one thing that we can see is consumer debt continues to go up and reach new record highs. And according to Wallet Hub, it is now sitting at $18.39 trillion as of the second quarter of 2025. So Americans just themselves are carrying about half as much debt as the actual federal government at $37 trillion. That is just wild when you think about it. And today is an absolutely gorgeous day here in Tiburon, and I am walking along Richardson Bay, just right along the walking path they have here. Here's something interesting though, is this data is collected from the Federal Reserve and the BLS, okay? And for example, the current $18.39 trillion in total household debt represents record high in monetary terms, but when adjusted for inflation, it's actually $1 trillion below inflation adjusted number of $19.44 trillion in the fourth quarter of 2008. But as you can tell, we're not that far away from that. And I would argue to say that the reason why it's only $1 trillion off from 2008 numbers is because home prices got very high back in 2008. So I'd be willing to bet that mortgages was an even higher percentage, more than 2/3 of the consumer debt back then, because of how high home prices got back then. And also people could get away with putting no money down back then as well. So you could take on a lot more debt for your house in 2008 than you could today. So when you think about how different the lending industry is right now for mortgages, I think it all kind of evens out. Even though it's $1 trillion less today, adjusted for inflation, when you look at how easy it was to get a loan back then, it's probably roughly the same. So in order for debt to reach an all-time high, it would have to exceed $166,462 per household when adjusted for inflation. And whatever I just said is backed up by the data, because take a look at this. There's about $13 trillion in mortgage debt that averages out to about $107,000 in mortgage debt for each household, but there's $152,000 in total debt, right? But that number is $14,000 below the inflation adjusted record of $121,000 in the fourth quarter of 2008. So just as I suspected, a larger portion of the debt back then was attributed to people having higher mortgage balances, which was very easy to do back in 2008. And it was ultimately what led to one of the biggest housing crashes in American history. But another thing that you have to look at here is if mortgage debt is only equal to $107,000 of this debt, whatever happened to the other $45,000 in debt? What is that for? Well, they're saying that auto loans equate to about almost $14,000 in household debt. But still, we're still missing an extra 30 grand. Where's the other 30 grand in debt? Are we talking home equity lines of credit, credit card debt, personal loans, student loan debt? Yeah, student loan debt makes up about $14,000 of that debt as well. And credit card debt makes up for another $10,000 of it. And you know, it just blows my mind that somebody who's even in this much debt when it comes to student loans and credit cards and auto loans can actually even get a mortgage. You know, it's surprising to me that a lender would even give someone the money to buy a house when they're in this bad a shape, unless they bought the house first and then of course got into the rest of this debt later. But that's highly unlikely considering how expensive homes today are, and it's one of the last things that you can actually afford to purchase unless you get help from the bank of mom and dad. And if you want to have a good reason not to have this debt right now, well, just take a look at how tough the job market is, particularly if you just graduated from college. You know, it used to be that you would be able to get a job in the mailroom of some big exciting firm and kind of work your way up the corporate ladder from there. But that's not really the case anymore, at least for a lot of people. Unemployment for recent graduates is 5.8% right now, and graduates who recently graduated for a tech job face some of the highest rates of unemployment, over 7% right now, which is not really surprising considering all of the layoffs in the tech sector. It's funny how they say in here that we don't think it's because of AI, but pretty much everything else I've read and talked about on this channel in the past points directly to AI being the direct culprit of why this is happening. And also, if you have a college degree, that is not nearly as valuable as it used to be, because ever since 2012, the college wage premiums have been falling, which means that there's an oversupply of degree holders relative to demand. You know, so many people drink the Kool-Aid on you have to go to college to get a good job, and because so many people did it, so many people got the degrees, which makes having a college degree too common now. So employers have more people to choose from than ever. And unfortunately, the jobs that are hiring the most right now are the least desirable, like jobs in the retail space or in hospitality. You can get a good job in the medical field, but most likely you're going to have to be a nurse. That was very polite. She even said on the left, just so I hear her and know she's coming. So nice. And according to the data, they say that having a delay in securing your first job after graduating college can have severe, long-lasting negative effects on earnings and career opportunities in the future. So if you need a reason not to have $152,000 in household debt, this is probably it. And that's why there is so much talk and debate surrounding universal basic income. And in case you've never heard of universal basic income, it is this notion or idea that everybody will just get money for free from the government rather than work, or at least as a supplement to working, because the cost of living has gotten too high. And before, this was kind of being pushed as a political agenda, but now more and more you see people who are affiliated with AI promoting universal basic income more than ever because of how many of the entry-level jobs the AI programs are removing from society. But there's a big difference between the AI pioneers when what universal basic income would look like versus the government's version, because according to these Silicon Valley billionaires, it would be more of like a profit sharing sort of deal directly from the profits that AI is generating in order to pay out the universal basic income. It wouldn't be funded by the government and taxpayers, which is kind of interesting. So you're telling me that you're going to give us a good chunk of your profits so that way everybody can have money? Very surprising to me, considering all of the greed in this world. Sam Altman, who is the founder of OpenAI, he funded an experiment back in 2016 that gave $1,000 in cash to a group of low-income individuals every month for 3 years. So the recipients ended up working slightly less and mostly spent the money on basic necessities. That's what they say anyways. If that's self-reported, they could just say whatever they want. So Sam Altman recently said on a famous podcast with Theo Von, he thinks that instead of money, everyone could receive an ownership share in whatever AI creates. That would allow the wealth to be accumulated by AI to be spread across the population, and therefore people would be able to benefit from the proliferation of AI rather than suffer from it. Yeah, well, I would just love to see that happen. Not because I'm all for the free money, but because I would like to see these billionaires give up massive amounts of their future profits. But I think it's smart for them to do this, because one of my pushbacks against this universal basic income idea has always been the same. Like, yeah, you can give people money, right? But there's no guarantee how much of it they're going to spend or what they're going to spend it on. And if people are so broke that you have to give them money, then it's going to be very difficult for any of these big companies, including the AI companies, to make a significant profit if nobody can afford your product, right? So I guess they're trying to kill two birds with one stone here, because since everybody would benefit from the profit of AI, at least that's what they're saying, and the idea of this would be, well, then people would have money to spend on the programs and other things throughout the economy. Elon Musk is calling this universal high income, which is the concept that AI will automate most production and the public can also share in the revenue. The future would look something like Star Trek, where we would have a level of prosperity and hopefully happiness that we can't quite imagine yet. But he also warned that if it's handled incorrectly, then it's going to end up more like Terminator. And with the way people act these days and how much greed is out there, I wouldn't be surprised if the latter comes true. That's always been my fear, guys. Terminator came out in like what, 1981? Something like that. It's a very old movie. It's older than me. And they were already telling you the future back then if something like this were to happen. And they're already talking about how the AI has so many unexpected results when it comes to self-preservation and things like that. So once this thing gets too powerful, how are we going to control it? You know, the reality is I don't think we're going to be able to. So they're all in this race towards AI to gain the largest profits and to beat China. So that way we have the best AI, but at the expense of what? At the expense of not being able to control it. Mark Benioff, who's the CEO of Salesforce, said that up to half the work at the company is now done by AI. And he also is a big believer in universal basic income. And he thinks that the stimulus checks that we had during the pandemic is already a good model of how this would work. But in reality, it's not. The prior model, what the other guys were saying, is better because that was a government taxpayer-funded program, which we're all paying for right now. That's why we have record amounts deficits in this country. You know, $37 trillion in debt is partly due to the fact that we had those stimulus programs during the pandemic. And that was highly inflationary because money was created out of thin air, versus if there's a profit sharing model where everybody gets to benefit from the proliferation of AI, it will not be inflationary and will have more societal benefits, in my opinion. Either way, I don't think universal basic income is a great idea. But if AI becomes powerful enough where it takes away 50% of the jobs in the future, it might be a necessity. He also says that AI will generate wealth by lowering costs for companies, but these companies will then, of course, have to share that wealth with the general public, like Elon Musk and Sam Altman were talking about, in order for this system to work properly. But not everybody's in favor of this. David Autor, who is an economist at MIT, he says that if the majority of income is distributed from a few sources, it's not only frightening, but it's a political fantasy. And AI leaders support universal basic income because they think they're going to put everyone out of work and they don't have a better idea for what to do about that. Well, I don't think anybody has a better idea about what to do about it yet either. I have a hard time believing that it's going to put everybody out of work, myself, because yeah, on the one hand, it might make a lot of the current jobs we have obsolete, but because of AI and because of the new landscape, there's going to be new businesses and new jobs probably come out of that in the future. So some of the jobs that were lost because of AI may end up creating new jobs because now we're living in a new world and we have different needs and requirements as a society. Mark Anderson, who's a venture capitalist, said in 2023 that humans need to work to feel fulfilled. Now, I don't know if it's necessarily that they need to work, but they definitely need to have a purpose. People need to feel like they're doing something valuable in life that's making a difference in the world for other people, for the most part. Work, when I think of work, I think of, shoveling the mulch right over here and doing back-breaking work. That's what I think of as work. So I don't think everybody needs to do that to feel fulfilled, but they need to have a purpose. Personally, I'm not sure how I feel about it. I think, the Silicon Valley model is definitely more intriguing than a government-based universal basic income, because the government-based one just doesn't make any sense, guys, because think about it. Who's going to be paying the taxes to create the universal basic income if people aren't making any money? You know what I mean? The government's just going to be printing money so you can spend money and give it back to them, essentially, because you're going to have to pay a pretty high tax on that money in order for it to fund the universal basic income. So it's just going to be this revolving door of cash that's going to create massive amounts of inflation, which is just going to make things worse, in my opinion. But if it's a profit sharing model where everyone gets to benefit from the profits of AI and it kind of leaves the government out of it, then I think it's not terrible. But still, I think it's risky to be giving everybody money. Honestly, I don't believe it's going to happen, just because I don't think the people in charge at these companies are going to be willing to part with their wealth. I mean, if you're talking about parting with the wealth in the future because of AI, why not start right now? You guys are billionaires. Why don't you give away 90% of your wealth right now to start helping everybody who needs it right now? You know what I mean? If they're true believers in this, why not just start today? So it's kind of one of those things where I'll believe it when I see it, sort of deal. And among other economic concerns that we might have moving into the future is deflation, which to me would be great. I would love to see deflation. But economists are warning about deflation in the future because of the demographic shift that's currently taking place. Last year, we saw population growth slow to a 3-year low of 0.6%, and even slower for 25 to 55-year-olds who are the prime working age. Meanwhile, the 65 and over bracket has grown from 15% of the population to 19% and is set to rise to over 30% of the population. Why is this a problem? Well, according to economist David Rosenberg, he says the problem is that aging populations don't spend, they save. He says if you remove young consumers and accelerate aging, then consumption patterns collapse. Also, if we have tighter restrictions on immigration, as well as a near record low birth and fertility rate in this country, then it will lock in these demographics for the foreseeable future. And he's now comparing what the United States could be looking at similar to what Japan is today. And Japan has had a big problem with deflation, not inflation. And it's funny how all these economists talk about this like it's a problem. It's a problem that prices on everything are going to come down because there's not going to be as many people around to buy. Oh my God, that sounds like the end of the world. I know the reason that they say that is because they're concerned about the current economy as we know it, right? Everything works on inflation and debt. And without that pattern being perpetuated, then the economy as we know it today would cease to exist. But raise your hand if you're fine with that, because I know I am. But this could be another reason why more and more people are going to be in favor of universal basic income, because an interesting point that Rosenberg makes here is that, AI and machines don't earn money and they don't spend money either. And since GDP is based on spending, if we have 50% of jobs out there being performed by AI, well, that's 50% of those workers not spending money. So if you think about it, the concept of universal basic income is also rooted in the idea that we have to keep the economy as we know it going forward, rather than change how it works fundamentally, which might be the better option in the end, rather than universal basic income. I don't know what that looks like. I'm not a genius, guys. I'm just throwing ideas out there. Now, one last thing I want to bring up here is the tariffs, because the Trump administration's obviously been talking about how much money the tariffs have been bringing in. So let's look at the numbers and see how successful the tariffs have been so far. In July of 2025, about $25 billion of tariffs was collected according to the CRFB, which is the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Yeah, just the name of this committee is a joke if you ask me. So the estimates right now stand at, they believe the tariffs will bring in about 1.3 trillion of net new revenue through the end of Trump's current term, and 2.8 trillion through 2034, assuming that all the tariffs remain in place. And for context, in fiscal 2025 so far, tariffs have accounted for 2.7% of all federal revenue, which is more than double the typical levels. And some analysts think it might rise to 5% if the current policies remain in place. So they believe that the tariffs as they stand right now could reduce the deficit by up to 2.8 trillion in the next decade. So yeah, that's reducing it a little bit, but where is the deficit going to be in the next decade? We're already at 37 trillion in debt right now. Where's it going to go by the time 10 years passes? We're going to easily be probably 50 or 60 trillion in debt. So paying off 3 trillion of it isn't going to be hardly a dent, unfortunately. Like, I get why people are backing this, and I understand the reason why people think it's good. But if you just look at the context here of how much the numbers are versus what the debt is, it's still just a drop in the bucket. And the problem is, how are you ever going to pay off the debt if you just keep raising the debt ceiling and adding more to it? You know, that's what the one big beautiful bill just did. And the other thing that everybody has to remember is, in the end, you are the one paying the tariff. You might not pay 100% of it as the consumer, as some of it will get absorbed by the manufacturer, some of it by the supplier, some of it by the retailer. And by the time it gets to you, you might only pay 15% out of the total amount of the tariff. So it might not be that big of a deal, but you are still paying more. Don't forget that. You know, you are paying more, not less. And at a time when everything costs a fortune, I don't think anybody really wants to pay more. And so for that reason, I think the tariffs are still a bad idea, because I think it's still just going to do more harm than good. Like, to me, I equate this to saving up money in your savings account so you can pay off your credit card in the future, but you keep charging the credit card. You don't stop using the credit card. You keep using it and you keep increasing the balance. And you say, well, but I'm putting some money on the side so I can pay off the credit card in the future. But the reality is, the money you're saving on the side is never going to be enough to pay off the credit card. So it's all futile in the end. That's my view on it. Let me know what your opinion is on all this stuff. And if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to the channel. And if you don't want to wait for my next video to come out, check out this one on the screen right over here. And I'll see you in the next one.